Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Adam, so much. And it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. I've long been interested in what's going on here at this institute. And from those of you I've met so far, I'm really convinced you've got something really special and unique going on here. So it's a real pleasure. So as Adam said, I'm gonna talk today about how nonprofit groups generate viral social media conversations. But I'm also going to talk about three other things. One is some new tools for automated text analysis that I think are a promising alternative to things like topic modeling. A second theme in the talk today will be using apps for social science research. So building kind of infrastructure that integrates some of the strengths of new digital trace data with some of the more tried and true survey-based techniques in the form of an app. And then lastly, I just want to say a few words about the field and where it's going, and invite you to check out some websites for the institute that Adam mentioned, and maybe I'll do that just very briefly at the end. Let me first, though, motivate this talk around the substantive issue, which is autism spectrum disorders. So as many of you will know, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of diagnoses of autism spectrum disorders over the last 10 years. Last 20 years, there's been about a 3,000% increase. And this costs quite a lot of money. Economic projections vary, but it's on the order of $270 billion to $1 trillion each year is spent in services for people on the spectrum and supporting families and so on and so forth. And I'm not really going to, talk a lot about the science behind autism. My research, as Adam mentioned, is more designed to explain the social processes that define how something as complex and variable as autism comes to be understood. So these are the ubiquitous puzzle pieces that appear alongside many activist campaigns around autism. Why are there puzzle pieces? Simply put, it's because very little is known about what causes autism spectrum disorders. So here's a list of the current competing candidates. One, many of you will have heard the widely discredited myth that autism spectrum disorders result from thimerosal in MMR vaccines. Earlier, one of the tropes was so-called cold mothers, Lyme disease, relative finger length, wealth, one of my favorites, Democratic Party membership. Also correlates very well with the number of Whole Foods in the area. Pesticides, air pollution, androgen, and I lied. The internet is my favorite. The internet, right? So the idea here being that there's some kind of broader shift in the way our attention is distributed across, especially digital spaces, that has led people to become more socially awkward. Or struggle in social interaction. Now, that's also an asset for studying this stuff, because it turns out that precisely because people on the autism spectrum suffer from social anxiety, much of the most interesting discourse occurs on social media sites that afford them, many scholars believe, a kind of relative anonymity, but also families affected by the disorder tend to mobilize and have discussions about autism online. This is not to say that there aren't many important conversations about autism that happen offline. I'll show you some data points about what those look like later in the talk. But it's all just a way of saying that, studying how people come to define what autism is on social media, given the lack of scientific consensus about what it is and what drives it, has a large effect on public acceptance of people on the spectrum, debates about how, for example, funding should be allocated to study autism, and so on and so forth. So the research question I'm going to try to answer today is, how do advocacy organizations, these are nonprofit groups, think groups trying to promote some type of social change around the issue of autism spectrum disorders, maybe trying to improve public reception of people on the spectrum, maybe lobbying for insurance reform, maybe lobbying for better representation of people on the spectrum within U.S. mainstream society, and so on and so forth. The talk's going to cover a few things. First, I'll talk some theory. This is a theory that's going to come out of sociology. It's also had kind of reverberations in communications theory and to a certain extent marketing. And I'm going to be talking about a theory of cultural resonance. Next, I'll talk about tools I've developed to combine social network analysis and natural language processing in the service of measuring culture. And by culture, I mean meaning, the way that people come to understand the world around them. It's a pretty broad definition, of course. Third, as I mentioned, I'll talk about how I've developed social media applications to study and evaluate this theory and this new form of measurement. And then finally, I'll get into the results and conclusions. So what is cultural resonance? The idea here is essentially that if you want to create some impact in the world, if you want to create some kind of change, you need a message that fits or resonates with prevailing cultural views. So, you know, a good example might be Occupy Wall Street. Somehow captured some of the kind of populist rage in the United States some years ago. And, you know, mantras like the 99%, which of course underscore the amount of inequality in the US, are widely regarded among people who study this type of social movement as an important source of its success. But I think there's a lot of problems with this theory, if we can call it that. The first is I think that really it's more of a description than a theory, right? So a discourse can either fit with prevailing cultural views or not. That doesn't really, in my view, cohere into a theory. It's more of a descriptive account of what's going on in the world. Second, it's very idiosyncratic. We can't generalize from the case of, say, Occupy Wall Street to explain what type of messages become culturally resonant in the domain of autism spectrum disorders, which is my case for today. And third, it's really prone to circular reasoning. So an idea works because it succeeds because it works. We can't really disentangle whether it's some intrinsic property of the message, the broader set of ideas that a society is captivated by, or some combination of the two. So my idea in the paper that I'm discussing today was to leverage social network analysis to try to formalize the theory of cultural resonance using a concept I call cultural bridging. So on the left here, we have the kind of, classical two components in a small network here. And, typically in social network analysis, we think of people or organizations as the focal point in a network or a graph. And following on some earlier sociologists, this paper instead treats ideas, words, topics, and texts as nodes in the network, something I've broadly called cultural networks. So instead of thinking about these as people who are connected by, say, a friendship or they're both employees of the same organization, you can also through a bipartite projection of people to the types of things they talk about, connect people based on whether they're discussing similar things. So here I'm trying to encourage you to think about these ties not as ties between people, but ties between people that are defined by people who are talking about similar things. And that's what I mean by a cultural network. Thus defined, a cultural network can be easily formalized using any of the many tools of social network analysis. The one I'll draw upon today is broadly the theory of brokerage. So you could think of it as kind of cultural holes. If you're familiar with Ron Barth's famous work on structural holes, the analog here is to think about resonance as a message that essentially fills what you might call a cultural hole. So if we think about discourse as mapped in this network space, we can then identify brokerage positions. Why might those be important for cultural resonance? And again, by cultural resonance, I mean why a message might succeed and really resonate, get people talking, which is going to be the outcome I'll look at in just a bit. Formally, I think the most important property of cultural resonance is that an idea is both new and familiar. So for example, if a discourse is too unusual, too new, it's incoherent. If a discourse is too familiar, it's unremarkable. And so maybe it's the case that the best messages are both new and familiar. And in a way, this kind of formalizes that. So the example I give in the paper is, let's pretend that these two network components here are groups of people discussing autism, and these people down here are discussing vaccines and whether those might be associated with autism. And these people up here, let's say, are a more learned group, and let's say they are discussing epigenetic predictors of autism, of which there is very, tentative evidence. And so the question is, you could design a message, right? You could talk about vaccines if you wanted to get these people talking. You could talk about epigenetics that would get these people talking. But what if you could imagine a style of discourse that would appeal to people in both groups? A good example in the case of autism is the concept of neurodiversity, or the idea that autism spectrum disorders result from natural underlying neurological variation and not some kind of pathological process. Why might that be appealing to people in both of these groups? Well, recent events have shown that the link between vaccines and autism has been widely decredited, but so too has the epigenetic explanation. And so it's a kind of explanation that can appeal to two people who are very different, but interestingly, it might appear both new and familiar to people in different parts of the network. And so in a sense, brokerage is a way of formalizing the fit between a message and the broader environment, cultural environment, if you will, of people who might potentially be drawn into a social media conversation about autism. Importantly, the message not only has the effect, I'll show, of encouraging people to pay attention to a new message, but also eventually puts these people into conversation with each other, creating something I call a cultural trellis. Okay, so here's a one-day slice of a cultural network. We're looking here at social media messages about autism, and we can, the nodes here are colored by their betweenness centrality, which describes brokerage positions. So each of these circles is an autism organization, and the ties between them, as I'll soon show, are going to be described by the similarities in their language. And so those in the middle with this dark orange hue have a high betweenness centrality and are occupying brokerage positions. In the rest of the analysis, we're going to be looking at a year and a half of data. So this is just a very small slice, but just to give you an idea of what the data you'll see are going to look like on a day-to-day basis. So to state the hypothesis a little more formally, advocacy organizations whose social media messages create cultural bridges or link topics of discussion that are seldom discussed together are more likely to stimulate comments from new audiences. This is not only because they appear both new and familiar to multiple audiences, but also because they put these audiences into conversation with each other. And those I'm going to show contribute to the viral spread of conversations. Note for the moment that there's no measurement here of the valence of people's position towards a message about autism. There's no people who like the idea that vaccines cause autism and people who don't. For now, I'm working on some extensions of the technique that will take that type of valence into account. But for now, you can think of this as analogous to a topic in a topic model. So just really focused on the content of the text and not the valence of the actor towards that content. So the research designed to evaluate this hypothesis. First, I identified a sample of autism advocacy organizations via US IRS data and a set of Facebook searches. IRS data includes nonprofit organizations that are federally registered as such, but many smaller inchoate organizations can't afford the legal incorporation fees. So I also include the Facebook searches to define the sample. Next, I extracted all posts produced by the organizations, as well as comments about each of them from Facebook's application programming interface. I just realized I neglected to catch a typo that I discovered last week when I presented. This is actually, the data collection period is December 31st, 2011 to January 1st, 2013. I'm going to show you more than one day. This created a bit of confusion in Zurich last week. Okay, so we extract all the posts, we get all the comments for a little over a year. Third, I count the number of unique social media users who make comments of more than 3 words about each organization's post each day who had not previously commented upon any of the organization's posts. The goal here is to measure new engagement at a conversational level by people who had not yet participated in a conversation about autism. And so this is going to be the outcome variable. And we restrict the outcome to comments of more than 3 words because, as those of you who've used Facebook extensively know, much of the commentary could just be something like "good," "great," or "cats," or whatever. People can be somewhat short-winded on Facebook, so we wanted to capture substantial conversations, if you will. Finally, we use this technique that I'll soon describe that maps these cultural networks, combining natural language processing and social network analysis techniques for weighted networks or weighted graphs. And we calculate the cultural betweenness of each organization by day. That's this measure of the cultural bridge, and we have a measure of the size of that bridge. And then we're going to look at whether this variable is associated with this variable. It's a purely observational design. We're not going to be able to make any causal link. So, yeah, sorry, and please feel free to interrupt. Yeah, John. Going back. Yeah. Yes. The goal is to measure engagement by new audiences. So, if you think about a viral conversation, for me, virality implies it goes beyond its intended audience. And so that's why we restrict to, by the way, if we don't use that restriction, we get a similar result. Oh no, they absolutely have multiple conversations. Yeah, let me get to the data. When I show you the data, I think you'll see how we don't make any assumptions about each organization only participating in one conversation. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, Brian. Uh, so it's a continuous measure. It's simply the betweenness centrality in this cultural network. But I guess I guess the idea there, trying to formalize it is that an idea that's new and familiar will be familiar to one audience but new to another audience, and that's another way of thinking about a brokerage position. We assume it structurally, and the reason is we didn't want to. You get down a slippery slope when you start to think about what criterion would you use for novelty. I mean, the question is novel for whom? Because if you've got heterogeneous clusters of conversations, you can measure. One of the measures we experiment. In fact, I can show you some results with using just new words in general, and words that haven't been used in the field before. And the issue there is we kind of got I mean we came down on this decision because we didn't want to impose any kind of ideas about brokerage that we had onto the data. That said, it's important to note that a lot of the brokerage that's happening here it can be really banal. So usually when we think about brokerage, we think about the software firm that starts doing law or something like that, or some kind of very obvious new combination of ideas. In this case, because we're primarily working with language, it can be something like it's Halloween and one organization is having a discussion about pumpkins and another one's having a discussion about ghosts, and then the brokerage position happens to be a discussion of pumpkin ghosts. That's a pretty strange example. I don't know where I pulled that one out. But you know what I mean? The idea was we didn't want to artificially impose some kind of judgment about what was new to the field. We wanted to let that come inductively from the data. Please, yeah. No. Yes and no, because a lot of these are really scale-free networks. Remember, so we'll have a lot of the new people. First of all, think of like a star net. You must have seen this in your research. Many of these social media graphs are just one popular actor and then lots of people following them. So most of our new people are actually people coming in from that kind of scale-free process rather than these bridging processes. We have looked at that. Did that answer the question? Okay. So let me get into the measurement of how you go from unstructured text to a weighted adjacency matrix. So up here, you can't read this, so I'm gonna try to read it for you here. We have 3 Facebook posts. The first says, autistic people don't want your cure. Neurodiversity is a fact. The second is, here are the facts. There is no cure for autism. Vaccines do not cause autism. And the third is, vaccines made our children autistic, not us. Okay, so the idea here is to try to capture the topical content of the message. And there's a few ways this can be done. At the end of the talk, I'll show you an R package I've written that includes a few options. One is to do some part of speech tagging and extract only, for example, nouns and noun phrases. The bet there is that that's where the topical content of most messages is going to live. So in this case, neurodiversity, autism, fact, cure, and so on and so forth. The other approach is to, without making that assumption, simply put all of the words in a message into and possibly do something like lemmatization or stemming or any of the other kind of standard pre-processing techniques you might use in a conventional autism text any kind of automated text analysis. And so basically, we tend to see you get similar results either way. The advantage of including things like adjectives is you may pick up a little more of the valence of people vis-a-vis a topic. So you might catch more of the people who use negative language around vaccines when they talk about autism. The next challenge, though, of course, is that certain terms carry a lot more meaning than others, and we want to somehow acknowledge that when we build this cultural network. So the way we do that is use very tried and true metric in the NLP world, which is the term frequency inverse document frequency. Essentially, words that are rare get a higher score in this measure, rare both within and between documents and the broader corpus. Then we take the union of co-occurring nouns or whatever part of speech we're looking at. We take the sum of the union of any 2 nodes, and that gives us a weighted tie. So for example, these 2 advocacy organizations have a strong tie because they both talk about autism, fact, and cure. But you'll note that autism has a very low TF-IDF because it appears in so many messages. And so we want to penalize that. We don't want groups to all be tied to each other just simply because they're talking about autism. We want a term like neurodiversity here to have a very high TF-IDF. And so from there, we simply create a weighted adjacency matrix where the cells are the sum of the overlapping terms TF-IDF. Any questions on that? No. So to calculate cultural betweenness, I use a modified Dijkstra algorithm for weighted networks. It has a tuning parameter alpha that allows you to basically allow weights to carry more influence or not. We see similar results in not only in the field of autism, but 3 or 4 other fields my lab has looked at using this measure, regardless of how much weight we give to the weights, no pun intended. Here's what the data look like across the entire time period. So this is the entire year. Here on the x-axis, we've got all the names of the organizations. The y-axis is the names of the organizations, and the cells are the strength of the tie between the groups. We see a lot of a very sparse region up here, and then we see down here a lot of the action is happening between a smaller number of groups here. It's kind of hard, of course, to see the brokerage positions here in this heat map format. The problem is if we try to visualize the entire network, it looks like a giant hairball. When we start making pruning decisions, we get into a kind of slippery slope that's in a way analogous to the decision of how to determine K in topic modeling. I can talk more about that if people are interested. The neat thing about the data, though, is we can do these projections over time. So here we have the same adjacency matrix on the X and Y axis, but then we also have time here on the Z axis. And what's really neat here is we can actually see these cultural bridges kind of emerging and closing. So if you remember the first diagram I showed you, described a cultural trellis, which is this phenomenon we see in the data where people come together and start discussing an issue, but then that very consolidation of people creates opportunities for future brokerage positions. And so in a way, you can think of it as cultural holes opening and closing, and that's what you're seeing in this data here. And of course, we're going to formalize that in a time series analysis that I'll show you in just a second. First, let me just show you the outcome. I had to break my own rule and break the y-axis because it's so skewed. This probably isn't surprising to anybody who's done analysis of social media discourse before. Most of this stuff follows a power law distribution where you see a very small number of messages getting most of the attention. The vast majority are getting no comments here. And remember, these are comments by new audiences. So we're pretty restrictive in how we count. And so the post that drew in the most new people who hadn't previously commented on an autism post got about 45 or 44 comments that were more than 3 words. Remember, we're also restricting to 3 words. Okay, so that's what the independent variable and the dependent variable are going to look like. And a lot of computational social science stops here. We say, given some data we found online, let's pick our favorite network method, and then let's run some analyses. And I think this is where the social science really risks falling out of computational social science. And I personally believe that the best work will try to use a hybrid approach that kind of combines found data or digital trace data with more tried and true survey techniques. The challenge, of course, is how do you do that? I'll talk about that in just a sec. So let me just give an example of some of the other things that could be confounders in this analysis. The wealth or the size of an organization. Maybe more wealthy organizations have larger followings and therefore can generate more viral, have more potential, or the hazard set of people who might participate in a viral conversation is larger. Second, it could be social networks and not cultural networks. So simply who is following who or who is friends with who on Facebook, independent of these cultural networks that I'm describing. There could be audience effects. The size and characteristics of the audience. A larger audience is more likely to generate a viral conversation, but also demographics. Research shows that younger people, for example, are more likely to comment upon social media posts. And so if we aren't attuned to these audience effects, we're left with a pretty weak analysis. And finally, these conversations aren't occurring in a vacuum, right? It's not one organization talking to one audience. There's events in the world that can, of course, disrupt and shape these conversations. So an example during this time period is the Sandy Hook massacre, in which the young man who so horrifically murdered the young children was suspected of being on the autism spectrum, and a debate ensued online about whether people who are on the spectrum are prone to violence. That type of event can have a focusing effect that would then lead to a lot of comments independent of the cultural networks I'm describing. And there's many more that we measure. We're actually going to wind up measuring about 120 confounding factors using this app that I built a few years ago. So this is an app that nonprofit organizations can use. And essentially what it does is it offers them a free audit of their social media outreach in return for sharing their data with the study. And so a representative of the organization comes here and we recruit them by email, primarily logs into Facebook here. Another nice thing about using apps for social science research is you can have an informed consent dialogue right at the beginning, unlike so much other work in computational social science. Here the user chooses a page that they're the manager of. And once the submit your organization's data to the study button is clicked, my app is now pinging the Facebook API to collect both public posts and comments that I described earlier, but also more than 100 non-public metrics that are known as insights data. So if you're familiar with Google Analytics for a website, and you can track demographics, how many people are coming, what are they doing, how often are they clicking, how many new audiences are coming, and so on and so forth. These are the type of metrics that Facebook Insights describe. They're a little more high powered than Google Insights because Facebook has so much more information about its users, and they're not, for example, inferred through IP address, how Google does it. The other nice thing about this format is we can add supplementary questions designed to pick up whatever other confounding factors we can't get through the publicly available Facebook data or the privately available Facebook data. So in this case, we couldn't get then some kind of features of the organizations, their annual budget, their full-time staff, how long they've been around. And so this is where an app is an opportunity, I think, to mash up more conventional digital trace data analysis with survey-based research. And once the user enters in all this stuff, which I won't do for the sake of time, the program generates a series of graphs that describe things like how well they're doing relative to their competitors in reaching various demographics, geographic locations, and so on. One of the other nice things about the insights data is we can get a lot of GPS data. So here you're seeing that this organization has fewer Facebook fans than the average in the sample. We can look at where the fans come from. We actually get city level data. All of these data are aggregate. So we actually, the only individual level data we collect here is the posts and comments, or really mostly just the posts. And so what you're seeing here are the aggregate characteristics of the audience of each organization or each post by day. And we can run a post level analysis. We can run an organization day level analysis. We wind up using the organization day level to try to tease out some of the longitudinal effects. Once again, you can't read this too easily, so I'll try to walk you through it here. This is just an overview. This is kind of a consort diagram that describes the target sample and who was ultimately recruited to use the app. We initially identified about 175 organizations, either via the IRS data or our own Facebook searches. We wound up excluding many of them because they were not advocacy organizations. They were things like schools for autistic children that didn't expressly have a mission of generating public conversation about autism. So of the remaining 130 or so organizations, 12 outright declined to participate in the study. 42 organizations agreed to participate in the study, and another 80 did not respond. Another virtue of this app-based research design, though, is that it enables respondent-driven sampling. So the organizations actually are incentivized to recruit each other to install the app, because then the overall analysis becomes more accurate. And so in this case, we had an additional 7 organizations that were recruited by other organizations to participate in the study. And so our cumulative response rate is about 33.8%. Remember, though, that all of the cultural network data, which requires some strong assumptions about the boundaries of the discourse, we get all of that regardless of whether people use the app. So this 33% describes the additional confounding factors that we're measuring, things like organization size, the number of women who viewed a post on August 13th, 2013, and things like that. You may be wondering if there was some response bias. We did some systematic analysis that shows no significant difference between organizations that did and did not install the application for all of the variables we could observe. The first is the outcome, the number of unique commenters by day. The second is the key independent variable, the cultural betweenness of the organization. But we also worried, for example, that we would only recruit poorer organizations that couldn't afford to, for example, hire a social media consultant. We didn't see any evidence of that. We also worried that we might only recruit new organizations who are more familiar with installing an app. This was way back in 2011 when apps were a relatively newer phenomenon. Once again, we didn't see any selection bias according to the age or wealth of the organization or the key independent and dependent variable. Here's the results of some negative binomial regression models. We run many other different types of models and get very similar results. The key story here is up here, the size of the cultural bridge, which again we measure as the cultural betweenness of the organization in the day before the outcome is observed. The only effects that are stronger in the model are the number of posts the organization makes, so they're not going to produce any comments unless they make a post. And their total number of fans has a very large effect. So if you're a large organization, you're going to have more likelihood of generating a viral social media conversation. Then we look at the social network data, closeness, centrality of the organization, betweenness, centrality of the organization, look at other metrics I can talk about as well. budget. We're able to measure how often the organizations are paying for Facebook advertising as a confounding factor using the Facebook Insights data. The number of audio visuals the organization uses. Again, research shows that people like cute cats, pumpkins, I guess, and so on. We also have the total number of people who viewed the page, and then a bunch of demographics that we create to mimic standard social science categories, such as those used by the General Social Survey, the American National Election Study. And these are things like age breakdown, gender breakdown, and region of the US. Finally, remember, oh, sorry, yeah. This is the size of the effect of the beta in the regression model. So that's the association between each variable and the outcome in the negative binomial regression. The number of unique people who made comments is of more than 3 words who had not previously commented upon an organization. Any questions? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other questions so far? Lastly, I didn't get to describe these last 3 confounding factors, which describe the broader external environment that these organizations are inhabiting. So the first measure is the number of news articles about the organization the previous day. We get this from the Google News API, or what was once the Google News API. The number of blog mentions of organizations in the previous day, same thing there. And finally, to capture the overall level of public interest in autism on a given day, we measure the relative volume of increase in Google searches for the term autism and some associated terms each day using Google Trends data. The substantive interpretation is that organizations whose messages create substantial cultural bridges, we define that as a standard deviation above the norm, receive approximately 2.52 times more substantial comments from new audiences than those that do not. So there's a number of limitations, several of which are probably obvious. The first is we're not able to make any causal inference with these data because they're observational. We couldn't find a good instrument either, so we are somewhat uncomfortable with strong causal inference based on the data, but we have a new study in the field that we're partnering with Muslim organizations to develop counter messaging to ISIS, and we have an experimental design where some of the organization's messages build cultural bridges and others don't, and then we're looking at the effect of those on social media discourse. Second, our analysis is limited to public Facebook pages. So much of the discourse that occurs on Facebook does not occur on public Facebook pages. These are so-called fan pages. There's also private groups. There's also the discourse you all have with your friends on Facebook that I can't see unless I have authorization. This is purely a story about the public sphere, the public face, the public conversation of discussions about autism on one social media site. We didn't do anything with the sentiment or the valence of the messages. Again, we're focusing exclusively on the topical content to build these edges in the graph. So we don't know whether someone is pro or anti-vaccine in that debate. We are currently building some extensions of the R package I'll show you in just a minute that will create valued edges based on sentiment analysis of the adjectives that co-appear in the sentence or adjacent sentences around the focal named entity or noun or noun phrase. But it's computationally intensive and somewhat difficult to scale. Fourth, we're unable to determine whether any of these online processes that we observe have offline consequences. Is it the case that an organization that generates a viral conversation then receives, for example, more contributions? We simply don't know. Oh, yes, in terms of the edges and how they're created. So our assumption is that the substance of a sentence lives in the nouns or noun phrases or named entities in a sentence. So, adjectives, for example, we don't think contribute much to the topical focus of a text. But as I said earlier, we can run it both ways. We get similar results. we also think that there is value in those adjectives, that we could create essentially better communities if we can create valued edges, and that's why we're off to go beyond the substantive interpretation and try to get at valence and sentiment. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 I mean, to a certain extent, that comes out in the noun phrases. I mean, it depends what you mean by quality. The other data points that may convince you are just analyses of other fields. So you'll just let me skip ahead for a second here. We here's climate change advocacy. Here's LGBT advocacy, and finally, here's organ donation. And for organ donation, we have all the other confounding factors as well, and still see this really strong effect of yeah.
So you have this comparative data with other effects.
Mm-hmm.
Those of us who take care of you notice some differences in the therapy. And I wonder whether you can notice some differences in the conversations themselves compared to these other control groups.
It's a great question. I think one of the real weaknesses of automated text analysis is you don't have the stories that you might if you did a more conventional qualitative analysis or discourse analysis. I mean, I can certainly say I'll give you some crude generalizations. So one would be discourse is definitely much more polarized in the case of autism spectrum disorder conversation. Exactly. Yeah, it's definitely more emotional to the extent that both negative and positive emotions, whereas other advocacy fields maybe are purely negative emotions, especially climate change, for example. As far as the conversations, I mean, they're just so far ranging. We're looking at hundreds of thousands of messages, so it's difficult to make a really general. I mean, I could, we did at one point do some kind of topic identification across fields, and it's the type of things you'd expect. In the case of organ donation, issues of equitable distribution of organs and insurance issues. International organ donation, a lot of things that wouldn't surprise you if you were an expert in the case. But yeah, I couldn't warrant a very great comparison without doing a lot more reading, I think. But I should at least maybe throw up some topic distributions that would be at least give a rough cut of the data, of the qualitative content of the data. A minute here. So I get a little latency on the clicker because it's on streaming. Okay, was I all done beating myself up? No? Okay, well, I want to leave time for you guys to beat me up. So, okay, unable to determine whether online processes have offline consequences. Okay, these are significant limitations of the research. But what's the payoff? I think we have a new theory of cultural resonance, which, as I argued, has, I think, heretofore been a largely descriptive, idiosyncratic, conceptual account of a social process and not a theory, and one that suffers quite a lot of circular reasoning as well. Suffers from quite a lot of circular reasoning. Second, there's a new tool on offer for measuring culture. The method I showed you today is a way of creating ties between people based on shared content and what they're discussing on social media, but the same approach can be applied to words themselves. And here there's a more obvious analog to topic modeling. So if you think about words and documents as having edges instead of people being connected by their shared use of terms, then you can run any kind of standard community detection algorithm. I'll show you in a sec some Louvain, for example, and you get something like a modularity class, which is tantamount to a topic. The main advantage and payoff of this approach, I think, is threefold. First, we don't make assumptions about bags of words. We have the advantage of triadic closure, especially to the extent that so much semantic theory and linguistic theory suggests that triads are essential in measuring meaning. Second, we have a more dynamic and flexible tool. And third, this is a tool that can be applied to shorter texts, such as social media messages, whereas topic models generally fail with these kind of small word applications. Third, there's what I believe to be a new research design that employs social media applications in order to try to recover the social science within computational social science, that is, get at all these confounding factors that we typically don't observe when we do social media research. So before I wrap up, let me just give a quick plug to this new R package. It's only been around for about a month, so it's still a little buggy, but here you see one of Peter Bierman's students used it to map the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte by Karl Marx. And this is work by my student Taylor Brown. This is discourse about art reviews in a really wonderful dissertation that looks at, uses machine learning to identify patterns in art and overlays them on top of social networks in order to take this idea of cultural networks quite a bit further. She also has extraordinary pricing data, which allows her to look at differential rewards, especially by gender in the art world. And finally, I promised I'd give a quick plug to the Summer Institute in Computational Social Science, not only because I would like you all to apply, and so would my collaborator, Matt Salganic, but also wanted to just briefly show that we made quite an effort on this website at the very bottom, if you scroll all the way down, to videotape all lectures and link all slides and code and data that are used in all of the topics that are covered, which range from collecting digital trace data, non-probability sampling, field experiments, mass collaboration, and a series of other topics that both Matt and I lectured on, as well as some really top names in the field like Gary King, Michael Macy, Deborah Estrin, computer scientists may know. It was just a really wonderful event, and we made quite an effort to make all this publicly available, and I just invite you to check it out. Lastly, let me say, it'll soon be announced that I'm going to be editing a new series for Oxford University Press on computational social science. We're looking for books that really fill the big gap in the book field right now around computational social science, because so many people are writing articles, of course. But if you're interested in that, please, and you've got a book manuscript in mind, please do talk to me. Here's how to get a hold of me. Here's a link to the paper today, and the data for the paper are also available on the Dataverse. So thank you very much. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
More than words.
Yeah.
No one wisdom about it. But
yeah.
I wonder whether you have any for hot areas like controversies like abortion or whatever.
Yeah.
Just like the whole series of things.
Sure.
A lot of people who will get going. A lot of their medium of cultural expression.
Right.
I kind of wonder if you have any thoughts on how to fold that into your method.
Yeah.
Whether that's you're just going to stick on the textual commentary in the pictures,
right?
Instead of the pictures
yeah.
aside, or what would you do with
I think it's a great idea. There's a few. I mean, so one, we do measure whether or not there's an image, but that's a pretty poor way of answering our question. We also, though, we do scrape any text that's in images and include those. So we crowdsource that data collection process because OCR, optical character recognition, work very well. So we do have the content of the text. But I think what's most interesting about what you're suggesting is that images aren't so different than text insofar as they're not just an array of a probability distribution of terms across documents, but say pixels across an image. And I think that's where this dissertation I just told you about that uses machine learning to, for example, estimate the number of or identify a generic pattern across a large set of artwork. The number of red pixels adjacent to a triangle near. We're actually my student Taylor Brown's actually doing that analysis. It's just wonderful. But I think your comment is more with an eye to advocacy issues. And there, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, especially video. We all know so well the power of scary music, right? Or something like that. And yeah, we haven't, you know, it's a additional limitation that we haven't done any kind of analysis of it, partly because there's so many. We have at Duke some pretty exciting people working on machine learning applications of video and image. And I would, you know, your comments inspired me to reach out to them. It'd be really, really interesting follow up. Yeah, Adam, yeah.
So, putting together.
Yeah. Huh.
Not just like.
You know, unfortunately, sharing around the end of the data collection process became the default privacy settings on Facebook changed. So prior to one data point, we have the ability to collect the names of people who shared, but then after a data point, which is somewhere 3/4 of the way through the study period, that becomes dependent on the user's privacy settings. So you can no longer see, for someone who hasn't set their privacy settings in such a way to make their shares publicly available, you can't see their shares. So then we run into this, you know, boundary problem where we can't know exactly who's sharing what. But yeah, sure, we could, and we have a study in the field now, a field experiment designed to look at the relationship between social media echo chambers and political polarization. We build Twitter bots that expose people to outpartisan opinion leaders and then measure pre and post attitude change. But it would be really cool, and I hadn't. This is why I'm so happy I came to get these wonderful suggestions for future research, because I think actually, yeah, applying the TextNets package to the discourse would be really instructive, at least insofar as we could see if, even if people don't move in terms of, say, their substantive attitudes, are they at least starting to talk in similar ways? Is that like, maybe that's where we're at as a country? I don't know. You know, we could at least start to have the same conversation, but that would be a meaningful outcome. Yeah, it'd be interesting to look at. Yeah, yeah. And if, exactly. And of course, we collect all the retweeting, liking data each day. We also have dynamic network data because each day we're scraping the networks of all these people. So that would be a great idea. Yeah, but I haven't done it yet. All right.
Again.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.